Welcome back to Tales Arcane, where we talk about D&D, TTRPGs, and fantasy storytelling. In today's video, we're going to cover disasters in D&D and how to run them. We're talking about fires, earthquakes, floods, environmental threats that don't involve fighting enemies, but can still be deadly and exciting. I have a particular system that I use for running disasters in my own games, and I'm going to be covering it in this video. Before we begin, a massive thank you to everyone who backs me over on the Tales Arcane Patreon. When you sign up to my Patreon, you get access to more than 1,000 pages of my original D&D content, including campaign settings, adventures, battle maps, and a whole lot more. There's a link to the Patreon down below this video. Now, very quickly, here are the 3 reasons that I would include disasters in your D&D games to begin with. Reason number 1, they give your players a break from combat without giving them a break from action. Combat, especially in a system like D&D, can become pretty repetitive and mechanically uninteresting after a while, and you can't always have these high-stakes combat encounters in every session. So doing something like a major disaster, saving people from a burning building, dealing with a sinking ship, is something that the players are going to be able to enjoy as an action event without thinking about combat in the way they normally do. Reason number 2, players like problem solving, and disasters are a great opportunity for problem solving. They can't just run in and hit something to win the day. The players will have to use their brains to work around the situation, to manage, potentially to reverse the elements of the disaster, and to save people in the process. That's one of the most interesting parts of it. It's almost like a puzzle, albeit a puzzle with more fire and falling debris. And reason number 3, disasters are just great opportunities for heroism. They're moments for players to feel like the good guys, plunging through a wall of flames to carry an unconscious NPC to safety. It gives players a reason to feel like heroes that doesn't just involve killing a dragon miles away from the townsfolk. This is something that could happen in front of other NPCs and build the players' reputations as the saviors of the realm. So here's my system for running D&D disasters. We start with a big call to action. If the orphanage is on fire, the players hear a bell ringing, they see people running through the streets in panic, they see smoke billowing up from a few blocks away. They run in that direction and the disaster begins. Alternatively, if they're on an airship and the disaster is going to be the airship catching on fire and potentially crashing, then the big moment of inciting incident will be an explosion in the engine room, sending shockwaves running through the airship. At this point, you want to establish the clear goals and time limits involved in this disaster. For example, if there's a fire at the orphanage, someone is going to run up to the players and say, "Please, we managed to get most of the kids out, but I think there are 3 or 4 kids still inside the building. Can you help them? If we leave them much longer, the building will collapse." If the players are on a sinking ship, the captain might ask them to go below deck and try to patch up the hull before the whole vessel takes on enough water to go underwater, and this will involve getting down into the flooded hull and doing some dangerous repair works while the waves batter the vessel. They've got a sense of a time limit, the ship is sinking, it will sink quite soon, and a clear goal, patch up the hull. Now, as soon as the players have their goal and an understanding that time is limited, they're going to roll initiative, just as they would at the start of combat. Going into initiative order is going to help you keep track of where everyone is and how time is moving along. Now, opinions will differ here, but I like to have a map of the disaster location, either for me and the players to look at, or at least just for myself to look at. This is going to help me keep track of where the players are, how quickly they're moving across the map, and it will also help when it comes time for certain areas of the map to become inaccessible or more dangerous as the disaster escalates. If you prefer not to have maps, if you prefer a theatre of the mind approach, you can do this, but just make sure that you have a clear understanding for yourself and for your players of how the area is divvied up. For example, if they're in the burning orphanage, have 6 key rooms mapped out in your head and describe those to the players. If they're on that airship that's crashing, think about the 2 decks and divide them into a middle, a front, and a back on each of the 2 decks, essentially creating about 6 separate zones in each disaster location. I always want to have at least 6 defined zones within my disaster location, and at the start of the disaster, I'm going to have 2 of those zones be heavily affected by the disaster. If it's a burning building, those 2 rooms are completely on fire. If it's an earthquake, those 2 rooms have had the ceilings cave in and have become filled with jagged, dangerous debris. A zone that is heavily affected can still be moved through by the players, but it will count as difficult terrain, and entering that zone or ending a turn in that zone will cause the player to incur damage. Now, you can randomize where where you place those heavily affected zones at the start of the disaster, but I like to pick 2 zones that are going to give the players a bit of a challenge. Maybe one room is burning and that's the fastest way to get to the other side of the building where the NPCs need to be rescued. So the player has to choose between taking damage and plunging through the flames, or going the longer way round and conserving HP. Now as the players go into initiative order and start making their way through the disaster location from zone to zone, we want to escalate things, escalate the stakes and the danger around the players, and basically this means having more zones become heavily affected by the disaster. There are a couple of different ways you can do this and we'll cover them all in this video, but the simplest option is simply to say that every 30 seconds or every 5 rounds, one new room is going to become heavily affected. It could be a random room in the space, or it could be a room adjacent to one of the currently affected ones. For example, a fire spreading from one room to the next. Now if the 30 seconds 5 rounds approach feels a bit rigid to you, maybe it feels too predictable, you can of course just maybe roll a die to determine whether or not the fire spreads. Maybe you roll a d8 every round, at the top of every round, and on a 1, the fire spreads to the next room, and all other numbers, the fire stays contained to its current zone. Personally, I prefer not to take this approach because, as you're about to see, we're going to be rolling die for other reasons, and if you want to take a more randomized approach, there are better ways to do it. Speaking of which, at the top of every round, you're going to roll on the disaster table, and the disaster table is a list of events that don't necessarily involve the disaster element moving from one zone to another, but which will make the players a little bit more challenged and endangered as they move through the space. For example, let's imagine that the players are on a sinking ship during a storm. At the top of every round you're going to roll a d6 and one of these things will happen. On a 1, a piece of the mast breaks and falls onto the deck. Creatures in the middle of the deck must make a DC 14 deck save or take 2d8 bludgeoning damage. On a 2, a wave sweeps across the deck. All the creatures on the deck must succeed a DC 13 strength save or be dragged overboard. They'll need to spend their next turn trying to climb back onto the ship. On a 3, the boat is rocked by a wave and all the creatures must succeed a DC 13 deck save or be knocked prone wherever they are on the ship. On a 4, water surges through a gap in the hull and temporarily floods one lower level of the ship. All areas of that level are now difficult terrain until the start of the next round. On a 5, debris and rigging fall across one area of the deck, making it impossible to move through until a creature spends their action clearing it. On a 6, a sudden lurch of the ship sends debris and furniture flying in all directions, and any creature below deck must succeed on a DC 13 deck save or take 2d6 bludgeoning damage. Perhaps the players know that the ship isn't going to sink deeper for another 5 rounds, but that's 5 opportunities for a whole lot of bad stuff to happen between now and then, so they still can't relax. Now, as an alternative approach, you can combine this disaster table with the mechanism by which new zones of the location are heavily affected by the disaster. Here is an example from one of my Patreon encounters, in which the players are trying to save some unconscious workers from a dwarven gunpowder factory that is on fire. The factory is divided up into 6 zones, 6 rooms in the factory, 2 of which are already on fire. But instead of having the fire move from room to room every 30 seconds or every 5 rounds, we're going to roll on the table to find out how and when it spreads. At the top of every round, I'm going to roll 2d6. One will determine what room I'm focusing on, and the second will determine what happens in that room. On a 1, the fire spreads or intensifies in the affected room. Creatures ending their turn in this room now take an extra 1d8 of fire damage. Going forward, this effect remains in place in this room. On a 2, smoke fills the air in this room. Any creature in the room is blinded until it leaves the room. If a creature ends its turn in the room, it must succeed on a DC 13 con save or take 1d6 poison damage. On a 3, a section of the roof falls in. Creatures in that room must make a DC 14 dex save, taking 4d6 bludgeoning damage on a failure and 2d6 bludgeoning damage on a success. Going forward, this room is considered difficult terrain. On a 4, an empty barrel containing trace amounts of gunpowder overheats and explodes. Creatures in the room take 1d10 fire damage. Consequently, the room is now on fire, or the fire in the room has intensified, depending on whether or not it was already on fire. Creatures ending their turn in that room now take 1d8 fire damage extra in addition to whatever they were already getting from the fire. On a 5, if a room has all its doors shut, hot air intensifies the pressure inside. The first creature to open that door will take 2d8 fire damage and is knocked prone, assuming they're within 5 feet of the door. After a door has been opened, the pressure dissipates. If a door was already open when this effect occurred, nothing happens. On a 6, a small section of the roof falls in around a door in this room, and the door becomes blocked. This effect remains in place until the blockage is cleared. Now we've covered all the core elements, let's bring them together. The players are going to get a clear call to action as they see a disaster taking place, either ahead of them or around them. Maybe they're already enmeshed in the disaster when it kicks off. They're going to get a sense that there is a clear goal, maybe people to save or ways that they can mitigate or prevent the disaster. And they're going to get a sense that time is limited. They cannot hang around. They're going to enter turn order, initiative order, just like they would in combat, and they're going to start making their way through the location that is affected by the disaster. Now you as DM have split that area up into at least 6 clearly defined zones, 2 of which will be heavily affected by the disaster at the outset. A heavily affected zone is difficult terrain and it damages players when they enter it or when they end their turn there. Every 30 seconds, or using one of the alternative systems outlined previously in this video, new areas of the map, new zones, are going to become heavily affected by the disaster. So more and more areas are becoming harder to move through and more dangerous to move through. Meanwhile, at the top of every round, you're going to roll on the disaster table, and something random is going to happen on the map that makes things more challenging, changes the layout of the land, forces the players to adapt and stay on the toes. Now let's finish with a couple of optional rules that you might want to include depending on your particular table. One rule that I would suggest considering is to have time limits on player turns, perhaps 20 seconds within which they have to make their move. This adds to that sense that they're in a highly dangerous situation and they don't have time to hum and haw. They are trying to solve the puzzle of this situation, work out how to save lives, perhaps manage or reduce the damage around them, but they also don't have all day to sit around and think about it. For some players, this will be a thrilling and immersive part of the experience. For others, it will be really stressful and unpleasant, and you should look at your own players and decide what's going to work for them. Another rule, which is optional, but I would highly recommend enforcing it, is to make sure that players don't talk to each other if they're not close to each other on the map. You really want to avoid metagaming if possible in this scenario. So if the party, as is likely to happen, splits up on the map, going into different rooms to save different NPCs, they shouldn't easily communicate across the table to coordinate their plans. For example, if player A is in one room and is getting low on health, they shouldn't be able to just turn around to player B and say, "Hey, I need healing, I'm on 3 HP. If that player B has their character way off on the other side of the map. Of course, it's good to avoid that kind of metagaming in any scenario, but it's not very likely that the party will split up and get that far away from each other most of the time, whereas in a disaster scenario where time is of the essence and they're running around in a large location, it is quite likely that the players will end up in different areas and will need to learn to resist the urge to communicate and metagame. Anyway, that is the video, and I hope it's been helpful to you, and I hope your players enjoy experiencing whatever disasters you cook up for them with this system. I've used these exact steps to run collapsing bridges, huge industrial fires, blowing up airships in mid-flight, even large monster attacks like Kraken or Tarrasque attacks. It really is pretty versatile. If you want to support what I do here on the channel, you can like and subscribe, it's greatly appreciated, or you can head to the link below this video, head over to my Patreon, and get access to more than 1,000 pages of my homebrew D&D content. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and by the way, sorry for the 4 or 5 month hiatus I just went on. I was so burnt out at the end of last year from trying to post daily short videos, weekly long videos, keep the Patreon going. It just got a bit too much, and round about Christmas I just crashed. I had no new ideas. I didn't even want to sit down and play D&D in my own time. It was pretty much all I could do to keep the Patreon content going, and so I just had to take a bit of time back, recharge, and get excited again. And boy, am I excited again. I've got a lot of ideas, a lot of stuff coming down the tracks, and a bit more of a handle on what content I can do without getting burned out. So, I'm very excited for what is to come, and I hope you are too.